Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly news recap. We are your hosts, Jacob Smith,
and Matt Morgans,
here to break down some of the biggest and most interesting stories of the week in the gaming industry. So far, our plans for the future of the podcast are to expand into webcam footage to help make this all the more engaging. We are also looking to answer audience questions and implement audience feedback. So if you've got any of either, feel free to drop them in the comments down below.
Indeed.
So first off this week, we've got a bit of the console corner / platform roundup. First of all, Nintendo has been in the rumor mill lately thanks to a Bloomberg report which states that a new, cheaper version of the Switch will be coming in June of this year. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a very interesting piece of news. I would not be at all surprised if it proves not to be a rumour. I think it's a sensible decision for Nintendo to make.
Mm-hmm.
They've kind of cornered their own part of the console market, where you have Xbox and PlayStation competing for the higher end, kind of beefier consoles, and then the Switch is the cheaper, more portable alternative. But it's still not cheap.
No, $300 is nothing to sneeze at, for sure.
Nintendo's had sort of something of a monopoly on the handheld market for a long time, but seeing them kind of pivot to a cheaper version of the Switch, maybe trying to attract more of this sort of solely handheld audience to console gaming, seems like something that they would do.
Yeah. It seems like a very Nintendo move, and what strikes me about this is that we've seen reports from various outlets saying that yes, the Switch is going to receive two new versions sometime in 2019. The cheaper kind of version, more sturdy. I've heard it's going to be geared more towards kids, kind of like the 2DS was for the 3DS.
Yeah.
And I've also heard that they're going to end up with a high-end version, so upgraded screen resolution, probably faster processing rates. What strikes me about this, though, is that June is really soon. Like, we're in the end of April, and for them to not have officially announced it seems like they're really hoping to just kind of come out of the gate with it and hope it's a success. If, of course, this report is accurate.
True. It's always possible with a report like this that the report might prove to be accurate, but it might be that those dates are outdated. Maybe it's been delayed, and that's why we haven't officially heard about it yet.
I think that's much more likely, yeah. But
it may be that they come out and announce this at either at E3 or at a parallel event. And we've seen companies do these kind of day one sudden releases, and it does usually seem to go well.
It's true.
We can look at things like, well, it's a very different sphere, Fallout Shelter, which just released day of announcement and did extremely well.
Yeah.
Whether that's going to work exactly the same with a console, I think is a bit up in the air. But also with a console, they don't necessarily need to rely on, huge day one sales. That console is then going to be on the market for a while. So I think making it available as soon as they announce it isn't going to be like a huge gamble for them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Moving on to another platform, the PC platform. I know you've got some comments or some news regarding Tim Sweeney's comments about Steam.
Yeah, some very interesting comments. Tim Sweeney
certainly
came out and said that the Epic Games Store would hastily retreat, he said, from pursuing these kind of aggressively achieved paid exclusives with game developers for the Epic Games Store if Steam would commit to matching their 88%, 12% revenue take. At the moment, Steam takes about 30%, whereas Epic takes just 12%. And that is a very interesting thing to come out and say.
Yeah.
Because it seemed to be fairly adversarial between Epic and Steam in the last few months, what with their aggressive pursuit of paid exclusives. But this kind of suggests that maybe they're more concerned about the industry than about their individual success. And the fact that they only take 12% is definitely a move. It's pitched towards developers, but it's also very pro-developer. they probably could charge more than 12% and still get a decent amount of attention from developers. They could easily go to 20, and they'd still be significantly under Steam.
Yeah, that 10% makes a difference.
So yeah, he came out and said that it would be a great thing for the PC gaming industry, and that it could allow these kind of platforms to go back to just being storefronts and not be so kind of aggressively corporate, which I think a lot of people would agree with, but I think there's probably going to be some skepticism as to whether whether the company is really going to stick by a message like that.
Yeah.
And that's fair. I think it's a statement where you're really going to have to see some action from Epic to believe it 100%. But I mean, this isn't some mid-level employee coming out and saying it, where the company can then come out and say, oh, their comments didn't represent the will of the company. This is the head coming out and saying it. So that says to me that this is something that they might do. The question is now whether Steam will actually take them up on it, and personally, I don't think they will.
No, so far they've kind of done a good job of pretending Epic doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
And, who knows how long that kind of method of business is sustainable. Something tells me it's not very long. But I think it's interesting because to me it seems like Tim Sweeney is regarding the Epic Games Store as more of a necessity to kind of balance out the PC gaming community and PC gaming storefronts.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting stance to take. Definitely something to consider. And to kind of round out our console platform roundup, just some slight news about the PS4. According to Wall Street journalist Takashi Mochizuki, he confirmed on Twitter that there will be no PS5 until after April 2020. No PS5 within the next 12 months. This reportedly comes directly from Sony PR, and is interesting if only for the fact that we get a more condensed timeline. Now we really only have a half year to work with for when it could come out in 2020, or it could come out in 2021. So when do you think we will see the PS5 soonest?
Well, I don't think it's surprising that it won't come out at all before April 2020. I think the news that came out very recently was more in terms of a response to Microsoft making statements about the next Xbox. They didn't want the Xbox to kind of just dominate that console conversation unchallenged. But yeah, there's not a lot of significance to the specific month, April 2020, apart from the fact that it's a year away. So I wouldn't think that they'll suddenly announce it in April 2020. At best they might announce it at E3 next year, so around June time.
If they're not more likely.
Yeah, if they're not planning to tease anything at this E3, which is certainly possible.
Yeah.
But in terms of a release, we might see it around about June time next year, but I think it's more likely that we might get like a firm release date at E3 and then see it release maybe in the latter half of 2020, maybe early 2021, kind of Q4 2020.
I think a holiday release schedule, if it is coming out in 2020, I think holiday is much more likely. But given the fact that Microsoft's going to be at E3, I think Sony might be waiting for Microsoft's move to kind of put their release dates around the same time to create that direct competition. So we'll see, coming this E3 with more details from Microsoft. We're sure to get more details from Sony after the fact, despite the fact they're not going to be at the conference.
Yeah, no doubt they'll be watching for the kind of features that Xbox announces, especially if there's any features that Xbox announces that don't go down well with fans, because if it turns out that they're working on a similar feature, they might kind of quietly remove it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, regarding more competition, because it's always fun in the industry, we've got more surrounding the Respawn Epic kind of head-to-head that's been going on regarding Apex Legends and Fortnite. And I know you've got a good story about that.
Yeah, so Drew McCoy, who's the executive producer of Apex Legends at Respawn, he published an open letter kind of to fans, and it really acknowledges a whole lot about the game and is surprisingly transparent. So one of the things it covers is just kind of discussing how the game has gone since launch. It says, we didn't really expect it to be this big.
Mm-hmm.
He makes a point of acknowledging 4 of the game's biggest issues. Acknowledges that these are problems and says Respawn is going to prioritize working on these. Things like cheating, which they are certainly already waging war against, but also things like audio issues that have been affecting players and slow server performance, which has been affecting people recently. And he was very open about the fact that in the instance of the slow server performance, Respawn actually doesn't know why that's happening, and it's currently being investigated. And hopefully these are things that they can fix relatively quickly, but it's refreshing to see that kind of transparency being offered by a studio. There's a lot of other studios who would not have been that open.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, especially because they're under the umbrella of such a big publisher like EA, it's nice to see that they can be that transparent, that because it kind of creates that connection with Respawn that fans have liked up to this point. So I think that that kind of, like I said, that transparency builds a relationship with consumers, which is necessary especially when you're in a market like the Battle Royale market, because it is such a constantly updated, constantly organic, evolving sort of system. You need to have that direct interaction with fans.
I do wonder if Respawn, and maybe kind of at EA's direction, is taking cues from DICE, who in the early days of Battlefield 5's launch was often criticised by the community for poor communication, and now are really making an effort to be more open and more transparent. So maybe that's a lesson learned and being passed on through EA to other studios like Respawn.
It would be nice to see a nice trend shift. Absolutely.
Certainly. Another interesting thing that they raised in this was that they kind of addressed that they're not planning to do really, frequent updates like Fortnite has been doing, and they kind of specifically said we don't want to push our developers to work insane hours. We want to avoid crunch and that kind of problems, which is a big problem for the industry at the moment. And that's another really good thing to see, a major developer coming out and saying we are actively avoiding this, even though it means we can't necessarily keep up with the pace of our main competitor.
Mm-hmm. I think that speaks volumes about, again, the kind of the level of transparency that they want to have, and I think that's a sort of direct response to the reports of crunch over at Epic, in a sense that they want to foster a sense of trust in the community, because I think players are starting to feel betrayed when they find out their favorite games are the result of people working ridiculously long hours and 6-7 day work weeks and things like that. So I think that again, it's a system of fostering trust, and I think will only benefit Respawn in the long run. Definitely. And Apex as a whole.
Yeah, I don't think that their decision... I don't think this is a new decision for them to be kind of against crunch in their studio. It sounds like this has been the case for a while, but I do think that the decision to publish an open letter where they specifically mention it is quite probably reacting to the recent reports of extreme overworking at Epic Games.
And I think, again, I think that's really smart, because Vince Impel is a smart guy. He knows how to run Respawn, obviously, given their amazing track record. And so it's no surprise to me that those practices are presently in place. It's not like he's saying, "Oh, we've made this major shift because we saw this in the industry." They're specifically calling out the fact that no, we continue to maintain this healthy work environment, these stable practices specifically for the sanity, the health of our employees, of the small development team that's dedicated to Apex. And I think that's something we need to see more of in the industry, because I think people will grow to see transparency as the norm if more studios keep doing this, and studios that are more closed off, we're going to kind of assume the worst, especially given recent reports in the last year or so of intense crunch at various large studios.
Yeah, it also makes them a more attractive employer, for developers working in the industry. If the studio that they're potentially looking to work for has a reputation for not, forcing unhealthy working conditions on their employees, then, if I were a developer and I had the choice between applying to a studio that is known for that and a studio that has been embroiled in reports of overworking, there's no question which one I'd go for. And that, could help them in the long run in terms of attracting the right kind of talent to their companies. So, yes, the other kind of main thing that they bring up in this is the division between Apex Legends and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Because with the announcement of Star Wars, there's been some concern among fans that Apex was going to kind of fall by the wayside. Especially with the recent reports that Apex, the interest in Apex and the viewership on sites like Twitch was rapidly in decline. And Respawn has now come out and said in this open letter that they are definitely not going to abandon Apex, that they're committed to working on Apex in the long term. They say in the letter that there's a clear distinction between the teams working on Star Wars and Apex, and there's not going to be any shifting of staff between those teams. And interestingly, they also say that to focus on Apex, they're also pushing potential plans for future Titanfall games into the future.
I think that distinction is really interesting to make, and I think sorry, continue.
They're saying they're pushing plans for Titanfall, which might be disappointing to fans of Titanfall, because that's a series that really was the victim of mismanagement, mostly from EA, where Titanfall 2 was critically acclaimed but commercially underperformed because EA chose to release it right in between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, I think it was.
Yeah, I believe so.
And as a result, because it was the lesser known of the three series, people put their money in the more established names, and Titanfall 2, got very poor sales, even though it was more highly reviewed than either of those two games. And it actually had a tremendously good single-player story campaign, which I think a lot of fans either appreciated at the time, or more likely they picked it up at a later date in the last few years and have since played it and appreciated it.
I think that's what I've seen from most people, most of the fans in the industry, is that oh, hey, Titanfall's campaign was actually really good. I think it's people going back and looking at that retrospectively.
But because of that failure, it's always been a difficult case for EA to warrant investing in a potential future Titanfall project, because they just don't have an established commercial success to point to. At the end of the day, they have to report to their investors, and the investors don't want them to take risks. So if the choice comes down to between, potentially making Titanfall 3, but the last game was a commercial flop, or making, another Battlefield where it gets a reliable audience, the investors are almost certainly going to lean towards Battlefield. But, they're saying now that they're pushing potential Titanfall projects, and I think fans might see that and be disappointed because they think, maybe they actually had something in development. I don't think they had anything in development. They say, in this open letter, they said plans for, they didn't say development on.
Key wording there.
Yeah, that tells me that they don't have any Titanfall games in development. Maybe they have some tech demos, maybe they have plans laid out for a potential game, but we don't know for certain that any of it has been greenlit for full development, and certainly we don't know if it would have been greenlit if Apex Legends hadn't come out. So I wrote a feature on this, which you can find on VGR, but I wrote a feature kind of looking at the prospects of Titanfall 3, with the conclusion that although they are saying it's being pushed, I think the chances for Titanfall 3 actually coming out have actually been improved by Apex Legends' success.
I should hope so. I should hope so. I mean, I think Respawn is a studio that deserves to have their original ideas heard and published, and greenlit. And I think the fact that Apex was in development before they were purchased by EA, they were absorbed by EA, is indicative of that fact, because they have great ideas when they have that wide creative umbrella. And I think the success of Apex, I hope it radiates into more projects for them, more original projects for them.
Well, the case that I made in the feature was that that they potentially they're kind of setting up for a perfect storm for getting permission to develop, a serious major Titanfall 3. Because by the end of this year, they'll have released Apex Legends to, huge success. Granted, the numbers have declined, but that's also not at all surprising.
Yeah,
given the circumstances that it released in, and it's not like they've dropped to zero. The game is still getting a lot of players on a daily basis. It's not been a failure by any stretch. Sure, it's not going to necessarily be able to compete with Fortnite, but to be honest, what can?
At this point, that's kind of the big question around battle royales and around Twitch streamed games.
So yeah, if Star Wars Fallen Order is a success, which we don't know at this point, but I think things are pointing to it at least being a positive launch. Looking at what we've seen so far and fan reactions, there's a lot of hype for it, which is a good sign. People are excited for new big single player story stuff. So if that's a success, then at the end of the year they can go, well, we've released this hugely successful first person shooter online multiplayer, and we've released this hugely successful single player narrative driven story experience. Those are the two things that really defined Titanfall. So we now have evidence that we can take to EA and say both of these were commercially successful. Let us make, a big Titanfall 3. Because I think Titanfall 2's multiplayer was well received, and it was a really interesting design. But it was the single player story that really got critical acclaim. And I'd love to see Respawn go back to the Titanfall universe with Titanfall 3 and do like a really in-depth single player story, because they did some really unique things with the Titanfall 2 story.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do think they need another chance to kind of prove themselves given the poor circumstances of Titanfall 2's release.
Definitely. And I think given the poor circumstances of its release, I hope EA is willing to consider giving it its own time slot, right? Because like you said, we've seen this with EA consistently. They release two big games too close to each other, and one fails. So I hope that is not the case with Titanfall 3, as do all Titanfall fans, I feel like.
Well, I think there's an advantage now, because I think Respawn as a studio has a bit more of like a widespread name recognition. I think they were certainly a known studio when they released Titanfall 2, but I think with the release of Apex and the upcoming release of Fallen Order, I think they're, as a studio, going to have much more widespread name recognition. So when it comes to a potential Titanfall 3, they've got the benefit that it's a very unique and very unique looking franchise. So it certainly stands out if they can get significant marketing behind it. But also they as a studio should have a larger fan base and a larger audience. So, when Titanfall 2 came out, it was seen as the underdog alongside Battlefield. When we get a Titanfall 3, it might not be quite so imbalanced.
Hopefully. I mean, again, we'll see what the future holds for Respawn based on their next two, their big releases, what they do with the studio and the sustainability of their studio. But kind of speaking of and bouncing off of that, all the studios that are trying to manage their practices, Bethesda's been met with some criticism regarding what they've been doing with Fallout 76. Big surprise there, I know. But you've got some news about that.
Yeah, so Fallout 76, before it released, Bethesda said that there'd be microtransactions, but they'd be purely cosmetic, and there wouldn't be any pay to win.
Mm-hmm.
And when the game came out, there were no pay to win microtransactions, so that wasn't something that I saw anybody complaining about. But in a recent update, they introduced a new item, which they actually announced a little while ago, but there was some initial outrage when it was first announced, but there's more of it now that it's actually been released, of criticism towards the game, accusing them of incorporating pay-to-win mechanics with their new repair kit items.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in their patch notes, where they actually released this repair kit item, they published a statement kind of responding to this criticism, and their conclusion was that the item didn't actually constitute a pay-to-win advantage. And I mean, looking at what the item actually is and what it does, I'm inclined to agree. I don't think it constitutes pay-to-win. I think people may have seen the suggestion that Fallout 76 could include pay-to-win and kind of went overboard without fully looking into what the item actually did.
Interesting.
You know, it is something which you are... So what the repair kit does is it repairs one of your items to 100% state. So if your weapon is damaged, you can repair it back up to 100%. And there's two kinds of these items, one that repairs it to 100, one repairs it to 150. Only the 100 one, the basic kit, can be bought in the Atomic Shop. And both versions of the item still show up in-game, in loot, in quest rewards. So you don't have to go and buy this. You can get them perfectly well without ever having to pay any microtransactions. But it's not providing like a damage buff. It's not, giving you an advantage that would really give you an edge in PvP combats. All it's really doing is saving you some time and saving you some resources. So I get where Bethesda's coming from when they say they don't think it constitutes pay to win.
Yeah.
It's also not particularly expensive. But regardless, I think what's encouraging specifically about this is it's not just that Bethesda said we don't think this constitutes pay to win. They actually came out and said, and quote, "If we find that repair kits do offer any sort of competitive advantage once they're available, we'll make any changes necessary to ensure that advantage is removed."
Ah, interesting. That statement I feel like is key to tying this whole thing in a nice, neat little bow.
Yes, because they're definitely trying something new with this, what they're calling a utility item. And, I can see where the arguments are coming from, calling it pay to win. I think there's a distinction that needs to be drawn between more sort of significant advantage pay to win items and stuff like this, where it's maybe just saving you some time. And I think it's also in response to fan criticism saying, we want a way to repair items faster. I'll be honest, I don't know how much of the pay-to-win criticism is really coming from the game's dedicated fans, or whether it's just coming from people online who are not necessarily playing the game
Who are just seeing this implementation and crying out, crying
kind
foul,
of jumping to conclusions a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised to see this story kind of fade away in the next week or two as people forget about it. Because I don't think this is going to have a significant impact on the game. I don't think there's going to be a real competitive advantage provided by these items. Yeah, and in a way, maybe we'll see. But
yeah, it seems like the most fair way to kind of do microtransactions, because obviously, in a game like 76, you're going to have microtransactions. I mean, in today's day and age of gaming, that's kind of just a foregone conclusion.
Well, it's fair to point out as well that they said that all the DLC, all of their DLC is free, and it's free because they're paying for it through microtransactions. So it's fair to say, they're not just including microtransactions for the sake of it. They are actually kind of giving back to the players in exchange, which I think is a good model. I'd like to see more studios actually take that model rather than just putting in microtransactions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, you feel like you're sacrificing something in having microtransactions, sure, but in a sense you're gaining a lot more by getting these giant chunks of DLC for free, like these big additions. So I think in a sense it's up to the fan base and up to Bethesda, obviously, in the end, to kind of balance the needs and wants of players, right? Do we want to include these small transactions and include these big updates for free, or do we want to kind of do the opposite, taper out microtransactions and big DLC is paid? I think they've made their decision, and again, like you said, it's experimental. They're trying something new, but I hope it works out in the sense that I hope 76 and its dedicated fan base is satisfied. Right, and
Hopefully.
I hope the game continues to evolve from its beginning state, because I honestly don't like seeing Bethesda in the state that they're in as far as 76's launch. It pains me as a longtime fan.
Yeah.
So I do hope they get their.
That.
Yeah, I really hope they get their foot firmly planted on the right steps going into the future with 76.
It seems like they're headed in that direction. I think there's still a lot of bad press, but they've been doing a lot to improve the game since its launch. They've done a lot of patches to fix a lot of the big problems, and now they're coming to the end of their first kind of DLC window, and they've got more coming in later this year. So I think they're on the path to improving the game, but there's a lot of stigma about it left over from its atrocious launch that is not easy to overcome.
I think so. I think that as much as they try, they can't shake the launch. They can't shake the past. They can really only look to the future.
Indeed.
That's going to wrap it up for us this week. Thank you so much for tuning in today. You can find these stories and more all at VGR.com. We are constantly looking for ways to improve the podcast, so if you have any feedback or ways you think we could do just that, please don't hesitate to leave your comments down below. Once again, I'm Jacob Smith.
I'm Matt Morgans.
And we will see you